It's late fall in 2023. Biden is still president. The panic and lockdowns of the pandemic have faded into memory. War is raging in Ukraine. And it's my last day at Amazon. I've just sent my last email from the Amazon address. The obligatory farewell note, thanking the team, waxing poetic about how much I've grown, and all the usual platitudes you include on your way out the door. My laptop is shipped back, and just like that, I'm free. Free from the code reviews, Slack messages, sprint plannings, and one-on-ones. And for a minute, the air doesn't taste like stale conference rooms anymore. It tastes like the crisp open air of fun employment. But that feeling mixes with a sort of terror. Quitting my job without anything else lined up was not the financially or professionally smart move. I'd be turning 30 next year, and I hadn't done a single thing I liked. And also thrown into that emotional soup is the strange, stubborn fear of missing out. I could so clearly see the path not taken. Stock refreshers, social capital built on promotions and projects, a comfort in the complicity of the corporate world. The roads we don't take leave their tracks on us all the same. But fixating on what I've lost robs me of wonder and awe, which I think are imperatives of being alive. So my antidote to the FOMO that's been fermenting for a while has been to widen the lens. Value science in the earlier episodes taught me something I'm constantly having to relearn, that I'm often mistaken about what I actually want. I thought I'd wanted, above everything, a stable career, a 9-to-5 that paid well, success, status, and material wealth. And then I got all those things and discovered they weren't all that I wanted. And in some cases, they weren't what I wanted at all. What I wanted was a life that meant something. My name is Vicky Shaw, and you're listening to Who Wrote the Rules, my story questioning the rules and norms we live by. This episode marks a turning point in my story. After unraveling some of the core stories I once identified with and shedding those names and titles I once let define me, in that exploratory space, I discover a bigger story, a scientific story about the origins of humanity. And through it, I start to find myself. Most people might travel after a big change, like quitting your job, which I did do. But my favorite kind of travel has always been reading. It's cheaper, portable, and available at any hour. A book lets me inhabit someone else's emotional and physical world, or pick up an idea I'd never have stumbled into on my own. And the language an author uses, the underlying assumptions and choice attitudes, almost always leaks something about their worldview. I started paying close attention to that, having just spent several months questioning my own. I read far and wide, cookbooks about salt, travel journals to remote places, literary canons and contemporary poetry, ecology books and long-form articles about rocks. It was wonderful. But eventually I came across one article in particular that captivated my attention. Its title was this: "We Need a Modern Origin Story." This article, by a man named David Christian, landed on my reading list because it was in the value science syllabus, which I was slowly working through. Reading it for the first time was like getting a letter addressed to me about my life from someone I'd never met. Here's an example of what I mean. He writes, "A bright young person goes to school, and they're full of questions, and their questions are about the meaning of life. What's this cosmos I'm part of? What does it mean to be human? They go to school, and the first great disillusionment, which we've all suffered, but buried deep in our subconscious, is that the teachers more or less say to you, Shut up about the meaning of life. Get on with your French verbs or your American history or your Russian history, whatever it is. And what we learn is that school is not about meaning. It's about a whole series of technicalities or fragmentary bits of meaning. At no point does someone try to help you put them all together. Then you go to university, and you think, at university, at least there will be philosophers. Same thing happens. Reading those words reminded me how I was one of those students once. I was never allowed to ask those big questions, maybe because no one else was allowed to ask them, or they just didn't want to. So when I learned that David Christian had spent most of his career trying to put those fragments back together, building a science-based curriculum to tell the whole history of humanity, I reached out. I wanted to know how a person ends up devoting their life to a question that big.
I always thought, what's the point of history? Why do we study history? And I think most historians would accept some variation of the following answer. We study the past because it gives us perspective on the present and it can point towards likely futures. So we study the past because it can help us think about the present and the future.
David Christian taught Russian history at Macquarie University in Australia for most of his career. He's retired now, but when he talks, I picture his sweeping gestures guiding me through the past, his own past and a much bigger one. They're the gestures of someone who spent decades holding the attention of a lecture hall. And though his specialty is Russian history, David Christian is not Russian. His parents aren't Russian, they're British and American. He wasn't born in Russia, he was born in Brooklyn. He doesn't live in Russia, though he studied there for a year. So why Russian history? The answer, like a lot of things about David, starts somewhere else entirely.
My childhood up to the age of 7 was in Nigeria because my father was a district officer in Nigeria. I played with Nigerian kids. I argued with them. I was never persuaded by the kind of implicit sense of superiority that many English people had in that era. It just never made sense to me.
David grew up in the 1940s and 50s, a time before the modern digital age, when each place, its people, economies, and culture were distinctive. In this post-World War II era, there was a particular pride in being British, having been on the winning side of the war. But David was, from the very beginning, a stranger to those kinds of affiliations others identified with. A British boy in Nigeria, then later sent back to a Britain he'd never really known. The boundaries other people took for granted that define races and cultures and whole nations never quite stuck for him. So studying Russian history wasn't all that strange a leap. But there was something else pulling him toward Russia, something the whole world had their eyes on.
Gosh, there's always the danger that you kind of mythologize in retrospect, but I've got a feeling that my interest in Russia had a lot to do with the Cold War.
The Cold War was a divisive time in modern history, when the US and Soviet Union stood on opposite sides of a global chessboard, and it was marked by the pervasive dread of nuclear annihilation. Families built their own fallout shelters, nuclear preparedness drills were practiced in schools. People were more afraid to survive a nuclear bomb than die from it. If you grew up in that kind of environment, I'd imagine an existential fear becomes part of you. In 1962, the US discovered that Khrushchev had secretly been building nuclear-armed weapons in Fidel Castro's Cuba. A perfect line of sight to the United States. This was a Russian retaliation of American deployments of nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, and started a tense 13-day standoff between the two governments, which we now know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the closest humanity has ever come to an all-out nuclear war. David Christian was a schoolboy then, and he remembers this time vividly. I mean, how could you not?
During the Cold War, we had this very, very strong sense of a world divided in two. I have this memory of a friend coming up to me during the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a day or two before it resolved, and shaking my hand. And I said, why you do that? School friends don't shake hands at the end of the day. He said, because I'm not sure we're going to see each other tomorrow. And we were in England. So England was within range of Soviet missiles. We grew up with the idea of the possibility of nuclear war. And my memory is that the thought flashed through my mind, are there kids over there feeling exactly the way I'm feeling? And how crazy this is. We're school kids. They're school kids. I'm a school kid. Someone's about to blow us all up. How crazy is that?
And that's how David became fascinated with Russia. He studied Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, wrote his dissertation on the role of vodka in the Russian peasantry diet, even lived in Leningrad for a year. He became steeped in Russian culture, and the more he learned, the more he saw something different from the stories he was told in his youth. Rather than inhumane, brainwashed enemies, he saw people who were fundamentally just like him. People who just wanted to live in safety and raise their families. People who enjoyed music, arts, theater, and sports. People who looked at the same stars at night and asked the same questions about their place in the universe.
So I felt it was really important just to help young people understand, I guess, to get the same insight that I got during the Cuban Missile Crisis, to understand there are real people living there. I mean, this may sound very naive, but if you read thoughtlessly, it's very easy to forget there are ordinary people living there, struggling with day-to-day issues, with family, with friends, with jobs, all of that.
He went on to become a Russian history professor. He wanted to humanize the other side and overcome this nationalistic boundary that had threatened to blow the world up. I picture a 5-year-old British boy in West Africa playing with his Nigerian friends at school, unable to see why anyone was supposed to treat him differently from the others. And I picture that same boy, decades later, watching two nations point missiles at each other across an ocean and wonder the same thing he wondered at age 5. Who decided we were different?
And I carried on teaching Russian history, but always with question marks around the adjective Russian, because for me, the real category was increasingly human being, whereas Russian was a constructed and flexible category and one that could be used as a term of abuse or a term of pride.
But something about what he was teaching started to nag at him. To David, the word Russian was a label, not a fact. But he'd still spend his lectures using the word, having students memorize dates and information that reinforced the label. Using the term Russian was still drawing boundaries, even as he was trying to dissolve them. Eventually, he realized he was giving the subliminal message to his students that humans are divided at a fundamental level into competing tribes. During our conversation, I reflected on my own education. History classes, in particular, were centered around conflict. Conquests and colonization, or ideological, religious, and class wars. I understood what he meant about the subliminal message. We've been teaching history through dividing lines. And when we're fixated on those details about how we're different, it's easy to forget that our fundamental identity, our humanity, is shared.
There was this implicit agenda, which it took me years to understand, which is an agenda about the history of humanity.
He began to zoom out of the myopic history and labels we've been taught to pay attention to.
If you write the history of Britain, at some point you have to ask, what do we mean by Britain? And we have to ask, is there a starting point for Britain? And ditto for the species. If you're interested in how we as a species and our strange trajectory to the point where in the Anthropocene we dominate change in the biosphere, no species has done that in 4 billion years. This is really, really weird. So the question, if you're interested in the history of the species, is what makes us so different? And also the related question, when did we appear? Now, that question led me, of course, to think not as a historian, but as a biologist, because that's a question which we nowadays have to answer using the Darwinian paradigm. And of course, once I started asking that question, I'm asking about life in general. How did life in general get going? Because we're part of life in general. And that led me back to the idea of the planet. How did the planet get going? And you can see how these questions just push me back and back and back and back.
He realized that the rich information that we've gathered from science had many of the pieces already. This exploration veered him into unfamiliar realms: chemistry, geology, anthropology, cosmology. He began to see that this version of history was so unwieldy, a terrifyingly large project.
And I thought, how far can this series of questions go? And, well, the answer is that in today, given the current state of science, they go back almost 14 billion years to the Big Bang.
He called it Big History. Before it became a full-blown free curriculum with international reach, David had to tease apart all the pieces as if it were a giant jigsaw puzzle with one unifying picture. It was a lot of work to figure out how things came together, and big ideas like this don't always land easily. When David first pitched this idea of an ambitious and comprehensive history course at Macquarie University where he was teaching,
my colleagues split. There were those who were really interested, and there were others who just thought I was having a midlife crisis, I think, which maybe I was. It's regarded as a bit amateurish, a bit unprofessional, and I think that is why there is such resistance. And there is a lot of resistance. You get, as a historian, you get much more prestige by writing books about, God knows, the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. I think many of my colleagues thought I'd gone off with the fairies.
David's colleague's response reminded me of a former coworker of mine who told me that quitting my tech job without a replacement was, quote, idiotic, unquote. He just couldn't fathom why someone wouldn't want prestige and money, as if that was the only thing there was.
I think my colleagues agreed to me teaching this because I was offering to teach a first-year course. And that's not a position that has great prestige in many history departments. And they didn't want to teach a first-year course. So here was I offering to teach one. So they held their noses and let me teach it.
It didn't give him the glory of teaching a specialized course, but it was still exciting to him. He described the exhilarating feeling of piecing together the parts as if he were riding a very fast motorcycle. He started reaching out to lecturers for this new course from all different schools across campus.
So I found myself talking to scientists. And again, it was a matter, I'd talk to some and they'd say, no, David, I don't think so. And then I'd talk to others and they'd say, wow, that sounds exciting. And those are the people who I found myself saying, look, would you feel like giving a lecture summarizing your entire discipline to my first year history students? And some of them said, yes, I'd love to. And so that was how we began.
One thing David observed through this process was that the science departments were on the other side of the campus from the humanities, and rarely did they talk to each other, another dividing line that we teach through. He found himself bridging this divide, both physically and philosophically, between the sciences and humanities, bridging the gap across campus in the pursuit to unify knowledge. He gathered colleagues from all across the academic spectrum, But no one knew how to put the pieces together. Each one spoke passionately about their own field, but they spoke in their own jargon and about their favorite problems.
The astronomers talked about cosmic background radiation, and I had to stop them and say, please explain that to my first-year history students.
While he acknowledges all that academia has brought forth, that big history is drawn on, David also calls out the culture of specialization. Each field digs deeper into its own patch of ground without looking up at how it fits into the bigger landscape. We've gotten really good at knowing things, but not so good at knowing how those things fit together. I imagine that for first-year students, navigating this fragmented landscape was probably overwhelming.
And I was trying to find common ground between all of these. And frankly, for the first 2 or 3 years, we'd get all these lectures. My students were totally confused. The people tutoring the course were totally confused. I was confused. But what was magical was within 3 or 4 years, I began to think, actually, there's a story here. But as a big historian, what I was trying to do was read other people and get my bearings on the current consensus in area after area, and then put them all together to create what anthropologists would call an origin story. That's an origin story for human beings living today.
You already know what an origin story is. They're everywhere. A radioactive spider bites Peter Parker, but the guilt of not stopping a thief who ends up killing his uncle reforms him into the superhero, Spider-Man. In the Haudenosaunee creation story, Skywoman falls from a celestial world toward a vast, watery earth. Birds catch her, a turtle offers his back, and a muskrat sacrifices himself to bring mud for her to spread across his shell. From the seed she carried, the world we know is born. Moses grows up as Egyptian royalty, but when he kills an Egyptian to save a Hebrew slave, he becomes a fugitive, turning him into the humble shepherd who's later called by God to lead his people out of slavery. Origin stories explain how and why something came to be. They're map-like in that way, grounding their characters in time and space, giving them a purpose, a reason to do what they do. And for me, big history as a scientific origin story helped give context to my existence and a way to connect me to all other life and to the whole of the universe. Seeing the arc of our treacherous path to the present day helped me stop feeling like an accident or a stranger in the world and more of a continuation of it. Big history provides the ingredients to a purpose. Not the whole answer, but a big picture to anchor me to my surroundings, so I can figure out a direction for myself. Back in the classroom, you can imagine the hurdles to teaching an origin story this big. One of the first things that David ran into was a particular nuance that students had to grapple with. Scientific theories are incredibly powerful, but not absolute. They evolve and get revised, replaced, or refined, and while that sounds like a weakness compared to other origin stories, it's actually one of the things that makes a story like Big History more honest and worthy. It grows with us. How can you write a human origin story about things that might not be completely true? When I was in school, I learned about rules, equations, and laws. Biology had dichotomies and cell structures. Physics had equations for all kinds of forces. Each element in the periodic table had their properties. And what I understood of science felt so rigid and absolute. At the time, I didn't grasp that these were just really good approximations that had been strengthened by centuries of experimentation. David talked about the importance of maneuvering students into this nuanced, unstable, complex position. recognizing that scientific knowledge is evolving and incomplete, and that science is incredibly powerful even if it doesn't provide definitive answers. But there are effective ways of moving toward answers.
What you're doing in big history is you're trying to get an understanding of what is the consensus in area after area. So I can ask a series of questions. What's the consensus about when our planet appeared and how it appeared? What's the consensus about how life appeared on the planet? And in some areas, there's a pretty clear consensus. In others, it's pretty messy, like with the origins of life.
There's a word for this type of consensus. It's called consilience. Merriam-Webster defines it as the linking together of principles from different disciplines, especially when forming a comprehensive theory. Consilience is what happens when a scientific theory explains and connects seemingly disparate facts. British scientist William Whewell coined the term and called it the ultimate test of empirical truth, which is to say, the most truthy of truths. Whewell considered the law of gravitation as a prime case of consilience because Isaac Newton's theory connected previously unrelated phenomena across different fields of study: the motion of planets, the behavior of falling objects, and the ocean tides. Gravity explained that the same fundamental force governs both celestial and terrestrial motions. The same goes for the theory of natural selection, plate tectonics, general relativity, ecology, and thermodynamics, and of course, much more. All the scientific theories are made more robust the more it can explain behaviors in other fields. And big history coalesces the extraordinary explanatory power of these theories into a coherent story to explain the incredible complexity we see and are today. Here's how David explains the curriculum from his article. The early universe, say 500,000 years after the Big Bang, was very simple. You have clouds of hydrogen and helium. You don't have any other elements, smatterings of lithium and beryllium. And they're very homogeneous, roughly the same density, roughly the same temperature everywhere. Gradually, over 13.8 billion years, more complex things appear, but they only appear where the Goldilocks conditions are just right. That's the story we tell. While the idea of big history landed with lots of people, it challenged certain parts of science culture, which was designed not to let biases like opinions and beliefs get in the way of experiments and results. Professionals defend this as a way to keep information pure and impartial. For example, a climate scientist can show you in extraordinary detail what the results of emitting methane or carbon into the atmosphere will do. They can give you the projections of atmospheric, oceanic, terrestrial changes and tell you the impacts on natural systems. But if they say, and we should do something about that, critics will say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Science has stepped out of their discipline. They say science can tell you what is, but can't tell you what to do about it. And there are good reasons for that rigor. For most of human history, what people wanted to be true and what was actually true got tangled together with terrible consequences. Doctors didn't want to wash their hands because they didn't want to believe gentlemen could carry disease. Philosophers call this the is-ought problem. And it goes back to the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 1700s. The argument is that no amount of facts about the world, how it is, can ever tell you how the world ought to be.
There's a naive idea amongst a lot of philosophers that science and ethics belong to different realms. Now, it's true that there's no logical connection between, in other words, you can't prove ethical things on the basis of science directly. But in the real world, the link between the two is intimate, as we all know. And the reason why the link is intimate is because we human beings are not robots. We all have purposes. So we study the world scientifically in order to fulfill those purposes. And those purposes are driven partly by a sense of meaning. So it's not at all surprising that science and ethics are bound together intimately. They can't be separated.
David Christian agrees with separating opinions from facts on a technical methodology level, but he also thinks that this wall has become its own kind of problem because it effectively tells a whole civilization that the most rigorous way of understanding the world has nothing to say about how to live in it. Logical deduction isn't the only relationship that facts can have with values. Facts can change who you understand yourself to be, which affects what you care about. That's what big history did for me. None of the facts I learned told me what to do with my life, but the more I sat with this expansive story that explained me and how I was connected to the Big Bang, the more I started to see myself differently. Less like an office worker climbing a career ladder, and more like an inseparable piece of the universe, connected to something much older than me. And when my lens started to widen, the things I had been chasing, titles, salary, status, started to feel beside the point. The facts had changed the self that was doing the valuing. David's persistence in his story inspired me. Where most of his colleagues treated questions of meaning as outside their job description, he kept asking how all the specialized bits and pieces fit together despite all the pushback he got. He spent decades pulling the fields together, even when his colleagues thought he was having a midlife crisis. Even when there was no real respect in teaching first-year students, and even when the story took years to come into focus. And the story, both big history and David's, let's say, origin story, has shaken up the questions I'm asking and the frame from which I see myself. Rather than asking, what should I do with my career? It's now become, what should I do with this brief, particular, improbable existence that the universe took 13.8 billion years to produce? I don't quite have the answer yet, but to bring you to a similar sense of awe for our place in the universe, I think it's important to share with you a brief tour through the Big History course itself and some morals of its story in the next episode. You can learn more about Big History through the Open Educational Resources Project website. That's oerproject.com/big-history. Special thanks to David Christian, who was halfway around the world from me when we talked. He has several books out, including Origin Story, A Big History of Everything, and another book, Future Stories, What's Next? Thank you to David and Holly for the early feedback. The theme song is called The Free Market by Musical Scalpel, and original scoring by Keenan Story. I'm taking my time to write and edit and produce this podcast, but I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this episode, rate, comment, and or share it with a friend. You can also now subscribe and support this project on Patreon or Substack. I'm Vicky Shaw. Thanks for listening to Who Wrote the Rules.